Everybody wants me to turn my Yamaha YZ450F into a supermoto. So I changed the wheels, the suspension, the brakes, the frame, the plastics, the engine, and okay fine, you caught me, it's an entirely different bike. But I finally got a supermoto, so you can't even be mad. The first time I bought a dirt bike, after years of street riding, it went something like this. I naturally gravitated towards the road and sidewalks, rendering a motocross bike pretty much pointless, which resulted in the normal YouTube response. You're doing it wrong. Take it to the MX track. You're an idiot. What a waste of a bike. And most frequently, get a supermoto. That's clearly what you need. And I will admit that you weren't 100% wrong either. Since then, I have gotten better at the dirt bike stuff. I spend a lot more time on a motocross track instead of the road, and I have to admit, it's unsurprisingly a lot better there. But ever since those comments about my troubled dirt bike beginnings, the concept of trying out a supermoto has been stuck in the back of my mind. Much like the other 80% of bikers out there. Because let's be honest, supermotos are awesome. So this is my 2018 Husqvarna FS450. It's the first supermoto I've ever owned or even ridden, and it's also the first Husky I've ever ridden. Although I have owned and ridden KTMs, which are basically the same thing. This isn't just some Husqvarna dirt bike that some random person tried to turn into a supermoto. This is a full-on 450 motocross bike that Husqvarna turned into a supermoto and now offered to the public to buy just like this. So, you know it's done quite well then. It's a 2018, it's sexy as hell. And it's pretty clean, especially considering that it has 136 hours on it, which is quite a lot for a motocross engine like this. The graphics kit is practically brand new, and although I do quite like this sort of worn out looking design, I would also like it to be custom and to rep the number 847 like on my motocross bike. And since it's basically a KTM, it has a steel frame, unlike the aluminium frames that Japanese bikes use. The subframe that you basically can't see at all right now is also pretty unique, because firstly, it's made up of 3 separate pieces, and secondly, it's made from a carbon composite, so it weighs just 1.4 kilograms. However, I also suspect that that means it costs substantially more to replace than a steel or aluminium subframe if you loop out and crack it. It's also in need of some new tires, has handguards to complete that motard look, and it also has traction control and rider modes. 2 of each in fact, which is ridiculous considering first and foremost, this is basically just a toy. I also quite like this silencer that you might recognize. It is missing the sticker and it does have some tire rub here that if I'm honest, I think looks pretty damn cool, I'm not sure why. It's an Akropovich, if you hadn't guessed by now by this distinctive end cap, and yes, it does bark. See? Speaking of good sounding engines, in my next video, I'm going to be tearing apart this V4 motorcycle engine for a project. I'm not going to say anything more than that, but subscribe if you don't want to miss what I do with this engine. And because it is such a practical bike, it even has a handy dandy fuel light, because Husky acknowledge that a warning light for something like fuel is a lot more fun than pushing your bike around. So that does mean that I've sold my Yamaha YZ450F that you guys were bugging me to turn into a supermoto. It was undoubtedly a fun bike, but it didn't really have much use to me after I got a 250. And the harsh reality is that I got a way better and way newer bike for a lot less money than it would have cost me to turn my YZ450 into a supermoto like this. Of course, I do still want to build one day just for the fun of it, but I first wanted to see what they were all about. You see, it's pretty much only KTM and Husky, the the same company, that will sell you a ready-to-race 450 Supermoto like this. And they do it far better than I would have. The FS450 is based on Husky's FC450, which is their full-on 450 motocross race bike. And for the most part, it's identical. It's got the same highly strung motocross engine that makes 63 horsepower, all from a single-cylinder 450 four-stroke. That's 14 horsepower more than a Kawasaki Ninja 400. It has the same frame and subframe as the MX bike and all the other random parts that make up a bike, but the essentials that would hold it back as a supermoto have been altered. The most obvious change is the wheels. Instead of a massive 21-inch front wheel up here wrapped in a knobbly, we have this little 16.5-inch front wheel with a road tire. Well, actually, this is a slick. And yes, it is kind of tricky trying to find a 16.5-inch tire to fit this wheel, but I'm hoping that it's worth it because this is the first time that I've ever ridden on slicks. And the rear is a more sensible and more common 17-inch, which still does look little next to the dirt bike's 19-inch wheel. To be honest, if I was building a supermoto, as in converting the YZ450F that I just sold into one, this is where I probably would have stopped, because just the wheels on their own are expensive. But KTM, or Husqvarna in this case, don't half-ass things like I do. So with the added traction up front, thanks to road tires, you can now get away with a beefy 4-piston Brembo brake caliper that's pretty much straight off of a ZX10. And this massive and gorgeous Golfer wavy disc. Keep in mind, dirt bikes have a tiny 2-piston caliper and a miniature brake disc because it doesn't take much to lock up a wheel on dirt. And to get the most out of that caliper, we have a pretty decent Brembo master cylinder up here too. But now that we have more traction up front and more stopping power, the soft suspension designed to absorb landings after motocross jumps is just going to bottom out the first time we brake hard. So obviously we have upgraded suspension as well, front and rear. That is a hell of a lot stiffer than this, has less travel than this, and is slightly lower overall than this. After all that, we have a pretty good bike. But they didn't stop there. It just makes sense to change the gearing on a motard since you probably will be carrying more speed. So this has a smaller rear sprocket to gear it for a higher top speed, but you will lose some acceleration as a result. There's also a shorter mudguard since this won't be riding through mud like a motocross bike, stopping it from bouncing around so much at high speeds. And don't forget the added slipper clutch, so you can downshift enthusiastically without locking up the rear wheel or having to feather the clutch yourself, because who has time for that? But other than that, it's just a motocross bike. After riding it around for a grand total of about 20 minutes, I can safely say that it isn't at all what I expected. The gearing, for example, feels way too long for mucking about, which obviously isn't its intended purpose, but I might get used to it, or it isn't difficult to change. The suspension is incredibly stiff compared to a dirt bike, making it great for the track. However, as soon as I can, I'll set these forks up for me. But I first need a fork pump, since the left WP fork has an air bladder that needs to be set to a certain pressure to be adjusted to the rider's weight. The brakes are stupidly good. I mean, it makes sense considering it has a serious caliper combined with a sticky slick and not much weight to the bike, but it still makes me giggle every time I get the rear wheel even an inch off the ground. Because usually when I try to stop your bike, the front wheel just locks up and slides. It feels more like a 250 in terms of weight, but then again, people do always rave about how light KTMs are in comparison to Japanese bikes, but it does make moving it around the workshop a lot easier. So I'm sorry to disappoint supermoto purists, but as you can probably tell, I haven't bought this bike to become a very serious racer. I've mostly bought it just to muck about on, because every new type of bike I ride, I become a slightly better rider. and that's ultimately been the most enjoyable part about riding motorcycles for me over the past year. I basically just want to ride every type of motorcycle that's ever been made. But let me know what you want to see with this bike. Personally, I want to do a top end on it because I think it really needs it, and I'm also keen to give rebuilding a 4-stroke engine a try. Other than that, I think it needs brake pads, it definitely needs tires, and possibly a graphics kit as well. I also really want to take it to a go-kart track to play with it because ultimately that is what it was built for. But besides that, you let me know. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it, and I'll see you on the next ride.